Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into some really complex ideas about political thought. We're not really focusing on, the usual policy debates or party politics. We're aiming deeper, trying to understand the emotional and psychological drivers behind one of history's most enduring political forces. The source material we're working with today presents a pretty striking argument. Conservatism isn't just about cautious governance or, ordered liberty. It's often seen that way, right? Prudence, stability. But this analysis suggests something else entirely, something much more dynamic, maybe even surprising. It frames conservatism as, well, a kind of ongoing adaptive defense of hierarchy.
Yeah, that's the core argument. The analysis suggests that if you only look at policy or principles, you miss something crucial. You miss the intensity and the consistency. If you track conservative movements historically, the pattern that emerges is one of reaction, a mobilization time and again against various movements pushing for emancipation.
Like opposing the French Revolution.
Exactly. Or the abolition of slavery or the civil rights movement. There's a consistent theme of pushing back against challenges to the established order.
And the analysis finds a single thread tying all this together across centuries.
It does. And that thread, the central psychological engine, is what the sources call the politics of entitled loss.
Entitled loss. Okay, that sounds like the key concept we need to unpack.
It really is. It's presented as the backbone of the whole analysis. Understanding it helps make sense of why these movements act the way they do.
So what is entitled loss exactly?
Okay, so think of it as this really visceral feeling, a deep conviction. It's the sense that some status or a privilege, maybe a position of authority, or even just a way of life that you feel you deserve.
That you feel entitled to.
Right. Inherently entitled to, and you feel it's being actively taken away, eroded, threatened by political or social changes.
And this isn't just like general anxiety about the future.
No, it's much sharper. It transforms that worry into something like righteous anger, a moral fury. And the big consequence is this. When you feel you're losing something you believe is rightfully yours.
Compromise looks bad.
Compromise looks like annihilation. It's not negotiation anymore. It's framed as an existential threat to your identity, your place in the world.
Wow. Okay, so reframing disagreement as an existential battle, that changes everything.
It does. It fuels the intensity.
Understanding that emotional engine seems crucial, which I guess brings us straight into the first part of the analysis, how this reaction is actually rooted in, well, basic human psychology.
Right. This is where it gets really interesting for me. It moves beyond just political history. It tries to ground this whole idea in empirical evidence and how humans actually operate.
Exactly. This isn't just speculation. The sources lean heavily on established psychological research. They point to some pretty influential studies that find consistent links between political conservatism and specific psychological traits, measurable ones.
Like what kind of studies? Well, a major one they highlight is a meta-analysis by Jost and colleagues from back in 2003. It synthesized findings from decades of research and found some clear, statistically significant correlations.
Okay, so what traits did they find were consistently linked?
Two main things stood out. First, a heightened sensitivity to threat.
Okay, more aware of danger.
Yes, perceiving threats more readily. And second, a lower tolerance for ambiguity. For uncertainty, for things being unclear or complex.
Right, needing things to be more black and white.
Sort of. Think about it like this. Imagine someone who really dislikes situations where the rules are fuzzy or keep changing, or where potential dangers aren't clearly defined. Someone high in threat sensitivity and low in ambiguity tolerance would find that scenario incredibly stressful.
And they'd want to go back to clear, fixed rules immediately.
Precisely. They'd seek stability, familiarity.
So you can see how that connects to resisting change, right?
Definitely. If you're highly threat sensitive, big societal shifts, immigration, changing cultural norms, economic disruption can feel inherently dangerous.
Because change equals uncertainty, and uncertainty feels threatening.
Exactly. The mind flags instability as a potential danger. So these traits, the analysis argues, function like psychological defense mechanisms.
Defenses against what? Chaos?
Against uncertainty and against perceived threats to the existing order. The status quo, even if it's flawed, is known, it feels safer. These mechanisms work to keep things stable, predictable, rigid, you might say.
But you mentioned it goes deeper than just resisting social change. You mentioned mortality. How does awareness of death play into political thinking, especially this kind of reactionary thinking?
Yeah. This brings us to terror management theory, or TMT. It's a really powerful framework developed by social psychologists like Greenberg, Kaczynski, Solomon back in the 80s. TMT basically says that we humans are unique because we're aware we're going to die, and that knowledge creates this underlying, potentially crippling anxiety, existential terror.
Okay, knowing we're finite is terrifying. How do we cope, according to TMT?
We cope by investing in cultural worldviews, things like our national identity, religion, shared values, and, importantly for this discussion, social hierarchies. These worldviews give us a sense of order, meaning, and symbolic immortality.
Symbolic immortality, how does that work?
By living up to the standards of your group, by contributing to something larger and more enduring than yourself, your nation, your faith, your traditions, you feel like you transcend physical death. You become part of something lasting.
Okay, that makes sense. We invest in our systems to feel safe from chaos and death. But wait, lots of people face mortality and react differently, right? They might become revolutionaries or environmentalists seeking meaning and radical change. So what is it, according to TMT research, that specifically pushes people towards defending rigid, traditional hierarchies when they're reminded of death?
That's the key distinction. Excellent question. The research indicates that when people are made aware of their mortality, what TMT calls mortality salience, they tend to show a stronger need for structure, for clarity, for authority. Now, for someone who already has that lower tolerance for ambiguity we talked about, this mortality anxiety seems to channel directly into affirming traditional hierarchies, established authorities.
Why traditional ones specifically?
Because they represent the most time-tested, seemingly durable bulwarks against chaos. They offer fixed systems, clear roles, everyone knows their place. It's the ultimate antidote, you might say, to the disorder and meaninglessness that death awareness can trigger.
Got it. So the personality trait low ambiguity tolerance makes them prefer order. And the existential anxiety fear of death drives them to seek refuge in the most established, most traditional forms of order available, which means the existing hierarchy.
We've got it. That's the convergence. And this is crucial. It connects that primal fear back to the specific political grievance we started with.
Back to entitled loss.
Exactly. The psychological engine isn't just some vague fear of chaos. It becomes this very specific, intense dread of entitled loss. It's the feeling that my status, my position, whether it's based on race, class, gender, wealth, whatever, provided that sense of order and place, is under attack. The thing that anchored me is being threatened.
And that specific fear, the loss of my place, that's the fuel.
That's the accelerant. It transforms the broad, primal anxiety about death and chaos into a concrete, actionable political grievance. They are taking away my rightful place, my status, my world. This specificity is what gives these movements their intensity, their moral certainty. They don't see themselves as just defending a policy preference.
They feel like they're defending civilization itself.
Precisely, defending it from an existential threat, embodied by whoever is challenging their entitlement.
So understanding the psychological engine, what does it tell us about these movements overall?
It tells us why they can be so powerful, so persistent, and, as we'll see, so adaptable. The political strategies resonate because they tap into something incredibly deep and primal. If you can frame politics as a fight to protect or regain status that people feel they are owed,
You're not just mobilizing voters.
you're mobilizing people who feel they're fighting for their psychological survival, their sense of meaning and order in the face of chaos.
And this kind of mobilization, this defense, it has a long history, which I suppose takes us to looking at specific historical examples.
Right. So the framework we're exploring sees conservative history less as evolving principles and more as this recurring pattern, a defensive hierarchy against challenges from below, against demands for more freedom, more equality. And to really grasp its modern forms, we need to look back at how these defense mechanisms were built and adapted earlier on.
And the natural starting point, the figure often called the father of modern conservative thought, is Edmund Burke, especially his reaction to the French Revolution. Burke's famous work, Reflections on the Revolution in France from 1790, usually read as a defense of stability, tradition, gradual change.
Yes, against what he saw as the dangerous, abstract rationalism of the French revolutionaries.
But the analysis we're looking at suggests there was something more specific driving his critique.
It argues that beneath the philosophical arguments, it was a sophisticated, deeply felt defense of aristocratic entitlement, of inherited privilege. See, Burke realized the French Revolution wasn't just changing politics. It was asserting that human reason, abstract principles, could override inherited authority.
And in that world, the basis of the English aristocracy's power inheritance didn't have a neat, logical defense.
Exactly. You couldn't just argue, we rule because our fathers ruled. That wasn't going to cut it anymore. So Burke needed a different approach.
He needed a new justification. And the sources say he used rhetoric, he made hierarchy seem beautiful.
That's a good way to put it. He aestheticized it. He brilliantly sidestepped defending domination based on raw self-interest. Instead, he reframed centuries of inherited power, the specific entitlement of the aristocracy and landed gentry, using the concept of prescription.
Prescription, what did he mean by that?
It's the idea that true wisdom and legitimacy don't come from abstract logic or a single moment of revolutionary creation. They accumulate slowly, organically over generations. Wisdom is derived from long-held tradition, from practices that have survived a test of time.
So he turned the kind of arbitrary nature of inheritance into evidence of deep, time-tested wisdom.
Precisely. He set up this contrast. The cold and geometrical logic of the French radicals, which he saw as arrogant and destructive, versus the rich, complex, organic tapestry of English tradition. For Burke, the English system with its aristocracy and ancient institutions was admirable because it was old, intricate, even mysterious.
Its complexity wasn't a flaw, it was proof of its superiority.
Right. He argued that the aristocracy's privileged position wasn't just their own benefit. It was essential for preserving the accumulated wisdom and beauty of civilization itself. They were the guardians of this precious inheritance.
That is quite the rhetorical move. Defending the specific interest of a small group by framing it as a defense of civilization itself against chaos and barbarism.
And that, the analysis argues, establishes the template. It's a pattern we see repeated.
How so?
Burke provided the intellectual blueprint for justifying entitled loss by externalizing it. If your aristocratic class was losing ground, it wasn't just your privilege being threatened, it was the very fabric of society, of order, of beauty that was collapsing.
It cloaks self-interest in noble ideals.
Exactly. It allows the defense of hierarchy to be presented in the high-minded language of tradition, wisdom, and necessity.
Okay, so Burke defended an old, established hierarchy facing a philosophical challenge. Now we shift to John C. Calhoun in the U.S., dealing with a hierarchy chattel slavery that was facing not just philosophical, but intense moral and political opposition. This is where the adaptability you mentioned really comes into focus, maybe in a darker way.
It does.
Yeah.
Calhoun's intellectual journey is critical here because it shows how the politics of entitled loss isn't fixed on one type of hierarchy. It adapts to defend whichever hierarchy is currently underpinning the power of the dominant group. Calhoun actually started out as a nationalist, a supporter of a strong federal government.
But he changed his tune.
Dramatically. As Northern abolitionism gained strength, posing an existential threat to the Southern slave economy and the entire social order built on it, he pivoted
Towards states' rights.
towards states' rights and the doctrine of nullification. His South Carolina Exposition and Protest in 1828 is a key text here. He starts framing the slaveholding South not as an oppressor, but as a virtuous minority being threatened by a tyrannical federal government and an unchecked Democratic majority.
So the entitlement being defended was the right to own human beings as property, and the social status that came with it.
Yes, that was the core entitlement under threat. But Calhoun didn't just stop at defending it as, say, a necessary evil or something inherited from the past.
He went further.
Much further. He shifted the argument onto moral ground. By the 1830s, he was arguing forcefully that slavery was not just acceptable, but a positive good.
A positive good. How did he argue that?
He argued it was beneficial for both white society, providing stability and prosperity, and for the enslaved people themselves, whom he claimed were better off under the care and guidance of masters.
That's a huge leap. What was the effect of calling it a positive good?
It made compromise impossible. If the system itself is morally superior, then any challenge to it is an attack on morality itself. Any concession is unthinkable. It attempts to transform the fear of entitled loss into a kind of righteous moral crusade.
And then he developed a specific political mechanism to protect this positive good and the entitlement it represented.
Yes, his most radical and perhaps most telling innovation, the theory of the concurrent majority.
Okay, what was that? Sounds complicated.
He laid it out fully in his disquisition on government later on. He argued that a simple majority vote, what he called the numerical or absolute majority, was dangerous, tyrannical even.
Because it could oppress minorities.
Exactly. It could allow the larger group to impose its will unfairly on smaller, distinct interest groups, like specifically the slaveholding South. So he proposed that major decisions shouldn't just need a majority of votes overall, they should also need the consent of each major affected interest group or region, a concurrent majority.
So how would that have worked, practically speaking, to protect slavery?
Well, imagine Congress is debating a law to ban slavery in new Western territories. Let's say a clear majority of representatives, reflecting a majority of the U.S. population, supports the ban.
Under normal rules, it passes.
Right. But under Calhoun's concurrent majority system, the Southern states, identified as a distinct minority interest bloc, could veto it. Even if they were vastly outnumbered nationally, their unified opposition would block the law.
It's basically a minority veto.
Precisely. It was an intellectual construct designed explicitly to entrench the power of the slaveholding class, to make fundamental change impossible, and to shield their core entitlement from the growing democratic pressure from the North.
That really shows the lengths the defense mechanism will go to. It will invent entirely new, arguably anti-democratic structures if needed.
It demonstrates that intense adaptive rigor. When the hierarchy feels fundamentally threatened, the intellectual justifications become more absolute, more rigid, sometimes even proposing to break the existing political system to preserve the entitlement.
So Burke provides the aesthetic defense of tradition. Calhoun provides the rigid, quasi-constitutional defense of a specific contested entitlement.
Exactly. Both show the pattern of defending hierarchy against emancipation. But Calhoun really highlights the evolution required when the challenge intensifies. The defenses have to become stronger, more uncompromising.
Okay, so the hierarchy Calhoun defended slavery was ultimately destroyed by the Civil War. But the analysis argues the underlying engine, that fear of entitled loss, didn't just vanish. It adapted again. Let's jump forward to the mid-20th century, post-World War II. We have the rise of Keynesian economics, welfare states, strong unions.
And critically, the massive social changes driven by the civil rights movement, feminism, anti-colonialism.
A very different landscape.
Right. This whole mid-century period, sometimes called the era of a great compression because inequality lessened somewhat, it posed a huge challenge to the old orders, especially to the traditional power of capital and established social status.
So for the elites, the economic and social elites, what specific entitlements felt threatened in, say, the 1950s, 60s, 70s? It wasn't land like Burke or legal ownership of people like Calhoun.
It was different, but the sense of loss was just as potent, the analysis argues. Economically, you had strong unions demanding better wages and conditions, which directly challenged the autonomy and profit margins of capital owners.
Feels like a loss of control.
A loss of control and a loss of wealth entitlement, especially with higher marginal tax rates funding the welfare state.
And socially.
Socially, the civil rights movement was fundamentally challenging the long-held, often unspoken entitlements tied to race. For many white people, particularly in the middle and working classes, the dismantling of segregation and the push for equality felt like a direct loss of status, a disruption of the familiar social order where their position felt secure and superior.
So a double threat.
Yeah.
Elites fearing loss of economic control and wealth, and other segments fearing loss of social status and hierarchy.
Exactly. The traditional hierarchies were being attacked on multiple fronts. The old defenses, based on tradition or explicit supremacy, weren't really viable anymore. The reactionary defense mechanism needed a major upgrade.
It needed a new way to justify inequality, a new story.
It needed neoliberalism. But more than just the economic policies, it needed a powerful moral argument to underpin this new defensive entitlement, especially the entitlement of capital.
And this is where the sources point to a really pivotal, if sometimes controversial, figure, Ayn Rand.
Yes. The analysis positions Rand's philosophy, objectivism, as providing that crucial moral voice, the intellectual linchpin for this counter-revolution.
How did she manage that? What was her key move?
Her genius in this context was to completely redirect the focus of entitled loss. She shifted it away from Burke's romanticized past, away from Calhoun's focus on inherited status or race, and she aimed it squarely at a vision of a hyper-individualist capitalist future. She essentially gave the defense of privilege a modern, forward-looking makeover.
How did she redefine who the victims were? Who was losing their entitlement in her story?
She didn't talk about aristocrats or planters. In her novels, especially Atlas Shrugged, the heroes, the ones being oppressed and losing what was rightfully theirs, are the men of the mind.
The industrialists, the innovators.
The industrialists, the entrepreneurs, the inventors, the financiers. The people she saw as creating all value through their effort and intellect. Their entitlement wasn't inherited, she argued. It was earned through their superior competence and rationality.
And who was taking it from them? Who was the enemy?
The enemy was the collective, specifically the welfare state, government regulation, taxes, unions, anything that interfered with the pure operation of the free market and the ambitions of these creators. She portrayed this system as fundamentally parasitic, a system of looters and moochers enabled by government, stealing the earned rewards of the productive elite to subsidize the mediocre and the undeserving.
So the entitled loss here is the loss of wealth and autonomy suffered by the competent at the hands of the incompetent collective.
Precisely. It's a moral justification tailor-made for entitled loss and an economic context. It makes protecting the autonomy and wealth of the capital-owning class seem like a righteous defense of virtue itself against parastasm.
It flips the script entirely. Instead of privilege being defended, it's merit being defended against theft.
Exactly. It recasts economic inequality not as a social problem, but as a moral necessity, the natural outcome of rewarding competence and punishing dependency. Rand provided the moral framework to celebrate wealth concentration and deregulation.
Okay, so Rand provides the philosophical and moral fuel. How did this translate into actual politics and policy?
This framework found powerful political champions in figures like Ronald Reagan in the U.S. and Margaret Thatcher in the U.K. They took these ideas and made them the governing consensus for decades.
And the policies followed that logic.
Absolutely. You see a pattern. Weakening or crushing trade unions, which were seen as interfering with the rights of capital, widespread deregulation, especially in finance, significant tax cuts, primarily benefiting corporations and high earners.
The idea being to unleash those men of the mind.
That was the narrative. The intellectual groundwork was laid by economists like Milton Friedman, whose work argued that freedom was fundamentally economic freedom, and the market, left alone, was the best mechanism for achieving prosperity.
But here's the really critical part, right? How were these policies, which clearly benefited certain groups and increased inequality, actually framed? They weren't sold as let's help the rich.
No, absolutely not. And this is where the adaptation becomes so sophisticated. The framing was all about liberation. It was presented as freeing the individual, the entrepreneur, the worker, the consumer from the oppressive burden of the state, from stifling regulations, from high taxes, from collectivist conformity.
So they used the language of freedom and individual rights, the language often associated with the emancipation movement.
Exactly. It's a brilliant appropriation, using the very vocabulary of liberation to justify policies that ended up concentrating wealth and power, creating a new, steeper hierarchy.
And how did this appeal beyond the super rich? You mentioned earlier the anxieties about social status loss in the white working and middle classes.
Yeah.
How did neoliberalism connect with their sense of entitled loss?
It tapped into those anxieties very effectively. While elites worried about capital, many others worried about their social standing in a changing world, feeling like their values and status were being eroded by cultural shifts, by affirmative action, by challenges to traditional norms. Neoliberalism offered a narrative that resonated. It said, your struggles aren't due to economic shifts or automation. They're because the government is taking your hard-earned money to give to undeserving others. Your rightful place is threatened by these looters and the bureaucrats who enable them.
So it channeled that social status anxiety, that feeling of losing ground culturally,
into support for policies like tax cuts and deregulation. It offered a different kind of hierarchy, one based on the market.
And this created a system where massive inequality wasn't just accepted, it was almost celebrated.
It was rebranded as meritocracy. The market became the ultimate judge of worth. If you succeeded, you deserved it because you were smart, hardworking, virtuous. If you failed, well, that was your own fault. Lack of effort, lack of merit.
Which makes the resulting hierarchy seem fair, even natural.
Right. It stabilizes the new structure of domination by making it appear earned, not inherited or imposed. So neoliberalism, viewed through this lens, isn't just an economic theory. It's perhaps the most successful modern adaptation of the reactionary defense mechanism. It kept the core engine fear of entitled loss, but updated the entire operating system. It swapped tradition and explicit status for the language of markets and individual freedom, ultimately reinforcing a new, powerful hierarchy of wealth and market-defined merit. #, conclusion.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. We've traced quite an arc here in the source materials analysis, from Edmund Burke, using tradition and aesthetics to defend aristocracy against revolution,
Through John C. Calhoun, developing rigid, almost constitutional defenses for chattel slavery against democracy.
and landing on Ayn Rand, providing the moral framework for neoliberalism. defending capitalist hierarchy against the welfare state and collectivism.
And what the analysis suggests is that across these very different contexts, there's a consistent underlying pattern. It argues that what we call conservatism, at its core, functions as a perpetual defense mechanism, less about fixed ideals, more about a recurring response to challenges from below, from those seeking greater equality or freedom.
And this defense mechanism seems to have three key components that keep showing up.
Yeah, first there's the emotional core, that deep, visceral fear of entitled loss, losing status, privilege, autonomy that feels rightfully yours.
Second,
The intellectual method, what you called adaptive justification, constantly inventing new arguments, new philosophies, prescription, positive good, objectivism, market meritocracy, to legitimize the existing or desired hierarchy against the latest challenge.
and third, maybe the most subtle element,
The political strategy, the appropriation of the language of emancipation itself, using terms like freedom, liberty, individual rights, anti-tyranny, to actually reinforce hierarchical structures and defend inequality.
So the big takeaway from these sources isn't that conservatism is simply about wanting smaller government or fiscal responsibility.
No, the argument is much more fundamental. It suggests it's primarily a politics of reaction, a continuous adaptable campaign to channel that primal anxiety about loss into building and maintaining durable structures of power, benefiting those at or near the top.
A politics that consistently frames hierarchy as necessary order,
Inequality is the price, or even the proof, of freedom.
and privilege as the just reward for merit or destiny.
Right, that's the core message this analysis puts forward.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to think about after this deep dive. If this analysis is right, if the reactionary impulse is so adept at using the language of freedom and liberation to defend hierarchy, then what current movements, maybe driven by a powerful sense of loss or grievance about changing status, might be doing something similar today?
Are there contemporary appeals to freedom or individual rights or fighting tyranny that might, on closer inspection, primarily serve to protect an existing social, cultural, or economic hierarchy?
What widely accepted ideas about freedom or merit might we need to examine more critically in our own lives to see if they're truly promoting liberation for all, or perhaps just defending someone's sense of entitled loss?